July 1945. The vast, pitch-black expanse of the Pacific Ocean was relatively calm. Gliding across the water at record-breaking speed, completely unescorted, was the USS Indianapolis, a massive Portland-class heavy cruiser of the United States Navy. Aboard were 1,195 men. Most of the young sailors were completely unaware of the historical weight they were carrying. Below the decks, under heavy armed guard, were mysterious lead-line cylinders. They contained half the world's supply of enriched uranium, the vital components for the atomic bomb that would soon be dropped on Hiroshima. The delivery to the island of Tinian had been a complete, absolute success. The highly classified mission was over. The ship was ordered to sail toward the Philippines to prepare for the final invasion of Japan. On the night of July 29th, the atmosphere aboard the Indianapolis was one of profound relief. The war was in its final, dying days. Because the ship's interior was suffocatingly hot, hundreds of sailors dragged their blankets up to the open deck, sleeping peacefully under a blanket of stars. They believed they were safe. They believed the worst was behind them. By the end of this historical reconstruction, you will understand how a routine transit turned into the worst shark attack in recorded human history. But more importantly, you will discover that the true horror was not the predators lurking in the dark water. The true horror was a military bureaucracy so deeply paralyzed by its own secrecy and negligence that it intentionally pretended nearly 1,000 dying men did not exist. At 14 minutes past midnight on July 30th, the illusion of safety was violently severed. A Japanese submarine, the I-58, had spotted the unescorted cruiser in the moonlight. The commander fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 2 of them found their mark. The first torpedo obliterated the bow. The second struck near the powder magazine and an aviation fuel tank. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. A massive pillar of fire shot hundreds of feet into the night sky, instantly incinerating over 300 men who were sleeping near the blast zone. The ship's communication system was instantly destroyed, but the radio operators desperately managed to tap out a frantic SOS distress signal before the power failed entirely. 3 separate Navy receiving stations on land heard the terrifying distress call from the Indianapolis. At the first station, the commander was drunk and entirely ignored it. At the second, the officer assumed it was a Japanese trap and dismissed it. At the third, the commander had left strict orders not to be woken up, so the message was simply set aside. With her bow completely gone, the massive warship took on thousands of tons of water. It did not sink slowly. It was aggressively swallowed by the ocean. In just 12 terrifying minutes, the USS Indianapolis rolled over and plunged into the abyss. Roughly 900 men survived the sinking. They were thrown into the freezing, pitch-black water. They were covered from head to toe in thick, blinding, toxic bunker oil that burned their eyes and made them vomit violently. There had been no time to launch lifeboats. The vast majority of the men were left floating with nothing but fragile, kapok life jackets. But as they gathered in massive, floating groups in the dark, tying themselves together to stay afloat, a sense of hope remained. They were an American warship. They had orders. The Navy knew exactly where they were supposed to be. They believed that by dawn, rescue planes would fill the sky. When the sun finally rose, casting a harsh, blinding light over the endless blue horizon, the men scanned the skies. Nothing. What the freezing, bleeding sailors floating in the Pacific did not know was that the United States Navy had already sealed their fate. According to strict military protocol, a ship's arrival was supposed to be meticulously tracked on the routing board. If a combat ship failed to arrive at its destination, an immediate search and rescue operation was mandated. But because the Indianapolis had been on a top-secret mission, a new, fatal directive had been issued. Combat ships were no longer to be reported when they arrived, nor when they failed to arrive. When the Indianapolis did not pull into the port in the Philippines on Tuesday morning, nobody sounded the alarm. Nobody checked the route. The bureaucracy functioned exactly as it was designed to. To the United States Navy, the ship simply ceased to exist. Nobody was coming. Then, the water around the survivors began to move. The catastrophic explosions, the thrashing, and the massive amount of blood in the water had sent shockwaves for miles in every direction, ringing the dinner bell for the apex predator of the open ocean, the oceanic whitetip shark. The attacks did not begin as a frenzy. They began with a terrifying, systematic precision. First, the sharks targeted the floating corpses of the men who had succumbed to their injuries during the night. The survivors watched in paralyzed horror as bodies were violently pulled beneath the surface, leaving nothing but expanding clouds of red. By the second day, the dead were gone. The sharks turned to the living. They targeted the bleeding, the isolated, and those thrashing in panic. The predators employed a psychological torture called bumping. A shark would violently ram a sailor underwater, testing his strength before circling back for the kill. The days became a horrific, rhythmic cycle of terror. The survivors would hear a sudden, agonizing scream, followed by a violent splash, and then a man would simply vanish beneath the waves. His life jacket would pop back up to the surface a few seconds later, entirely empty. But the sharks were only one fraction of the torment. As the days dragged on, the tropical sun became a relentless enemy. With temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the men suffered from catastrophic dehydration and severe photophobia, their eyes literally burning from the glare of the sun on the oil-slicked water. At night, the temperature plummeted, inducing uncontrollable, violent shivering and hypothermia. By the third day, collective madness consumed the floating masses. Driven completely insane by severe dehydration, dozens of men broke the ultimate rule of survival and drank the ocean water. The high salt content caused immediate catastrophic swelling of the brain, leading to violent hallucinations. Men began to scream that they could see the Indianapolis perfectly intact, resting just below the surface, offering cold water and fresh food. They untied their life jackets and swam down into the dark abyss, willingly drowning themselves. Others, gripped by paranoid delirium, convinced themselves that their fellow sailors were Japanese infiltrators. Men began violently stabbing each other with survival knives, fighting to the death in the middle of the ocean. And with every drop of fresh blood spilled by human hands, more sharks arrived. The water boiled with predators and madness for 96 straight hours. The 900 men were slowly, methodically being erased. On the fourth day, the nightmare was broken by an act of pure, blind luck. A Navy PV-1 Ventura bomber, flying a routine anti-submarine patrol, was passing high overhead. The pilot, Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn, was annoyed by a broken trailing wire antenna. He left his controls, walked to the back of the plane, and happened to glance out the window to fix it. He noticed a massive oil slick on the water. As he descended to investigate what he thought was an enemy submarine, he saw them. Hundreds of tiny black dots, bobbing in the water, frantically splashing to keep the circling sharks away. It was not a rescue mission, it was a complete accident. When the rescue ships finally arrived, the sheer scale of the massacre was almost impossible to process. Out of the 1,195 men who had sailed on the USS Indianapolis, only 316 were pulled from the water alive. Nearly 600 men had survived the sinking, only to be slowly consumed by the elements, the madness, and the sharks, while their own military forgot them. When the horrifying truth reached the American public, the Navy faced an absolute public relations catastrophe. They desperately needed a scapegoat to cover up the fact that their bureaucratic negligence had allowed hundreds of American heroes to be eaten alive. They found their victim in Captain Charles McVay, one of the few survivors. In an act of unprecedented institutional cowardice, the Navy court-martialed Captain McVay, blaming him entirely for the loss of the ship. They went to the extreme, shameful length of bringing Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who sank the Indianapolis, into an American courtroom to testify against McVay. Even though the Japanese commander explicitly stated that no evasive maneuvers could have saved the ship, the Navy found McVay guilty. They completely destroyed the reputation of a broken man, rather than admit that the system itself was responsible for the slaughter. The ocean is an unforgiving void that does not care about human life, but the deepest betrayals are rarely committed by nature. If the 4-day feast of the Indianapolis has shown that the darkest monsters wear uniforms of bureaucracy, then the vaults of history hold even darker secrets. Leave a comment below suggesting which catastrophic institutional failure, historical cover-up, or deadly anomaly should be dragged into the light and reconstructed next.